I mean, it's just kind of sit up and whoa, this is like watching TV.
Well, it's funny because yeah, those last sections in Daniel are very concerned about the two empires which sort of keep conquering, the empire of the Seleucids and the empire of the Ptolemy, sort of the people who came after, well, the empires that followed the empire of Alexander the Great. Basically, Alexander's empire gets sort of split into four groups, and unfortunately, Judea is right in the middle between two of them. So they get conquered over and over and over and over again, until the Romans put an end to all that and just conquered once and for good. Right, so let's get started on Romans 4:13. We left off last week looking at verses 9 through 12. And the big things we took away from that was, does the family of faith, the faith family, have to regard Abraham as their physical father? And the definitive answer is no. You don't need to regard Abraham as your physical father, because Abraham was justified freely by grace through faith, without works. And as was the sinful David. We see that in there as well. And it was this faith precisely in the God who justifies the ungodly. That's that fascinating term Paul uses last week, that idea that Abraham is ungodly before God calls him out of Ur. And what's fascinating about that, of course, is that Abraham is justified while being uncircumcised, which shows that it's not the law, and ultimately, when we can extrapolate off that it's not works, which is what saves us. It is the faith. In Genesis 15:6, his faith was reckoned righteousness. His faith was counted as righteousness. That's before circumcision, which is in chapter 17, and it's a big part of the thought process behind this. And there's that fascinating idea that Gentiles have a unique relationship with Abraham, because Gentiles are called out of their idolatry into the faith, just as Abraham was called out, just the same way. So just as Abraham didn't need to be circumcised to be justified, so too the Gentiles don't need to be as well. But as once again, we can extrapolate beyond that to notice that this is a profound defense in its own right of justification by faith. That's key here. But those two, remember, those are the two sides of this. We always have to kind of be careful of that. There's a lot here about what it means to be justified by faith. There's a lot here too about the covenant. These two ideas are both at play here. So let's look at verse 13 as we move along. For the promise to Abraham and his offspring that he would be heir of the world did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs. Faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression. This is a dense passage right here of what Paul's talking about. Remember, key thing we always look for is when we see that word for. So it's a grounding term, which means you're going to explain more of what's come before. Annoyingly, some translations of this don't include the for, and so it can kind of be a little bit confusing how the argument is going. I was looking at the NIV skips for here, but the for is definitely there in the text. It's a guard in the Greek. It's definitely there. And so what is he talking about here? So in the beginning of this verse, sort of the gist of it, is he saying that the boundary markers of who will be the heirs, right, the heirs of Abraham, that boundary marker is made through the covenant promises made to Abraham, and his offspring could not be from the law. His offspring, the seed, this argument, that cannot be from the law, but must have come through the righteousness of faith. So what does that mean for the argument that's been moving to this point? That circumcision is neither necessary nor sufficient for membership in the faith family. We looked at 1 Corinthians last week to see Paul's opinion of circumcision. It's one of those things where someone who is circumcised doesn't have to reverse that or something like that. but also someone who is not circumcised does not have to go through that boundary to become an Abrahamic faith. That's the idea here. And now in 13, he's expanding that a little bit further. Good evening, Penny. Come on in.
Sorry.
No problem. So now he's expanding that even a little bit further. We're right on verse 13. We just got started. Because if circumcision is the thing that makes you part, the heir of this promise, it would make the law, the Torah, the badge of membership. So remember, whenever we think of the law here, the law, we're thinking of the Torah. We're thinking of the law given to Moses and to the people. And so a key concept in our mind is always to remember is that the promise comes to Abraham before the law, before the Torah. So the promise can't be connected to the law. It can't be connected to the Torah. It can't be connected to anything but the faith Abraham had at the beginning. So let's look at a couple passages just to kind of refresh our memory about the problem with the law in terms of that. So let's look at 3:19. Just work our way back to 3:19 really quickly. Verses basically 1:18 through 3:20, for all intents and purposes, are in some sense a condemnation of mankind, expressing to us the need for the just and justified. Let's look at 3:19 really quickly. Now we know that whatever the law says, it speaks to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be stopped and the whole world may be held accountable to God. For by works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. So we see that the law has is in a way, one of the main purposes of the law is to show sort of a mirror for us to see our own sinfulness. That's a primary purpose of it. We'll talk more about some other purposes of the law as we go along, but that's something to always keep in mind. So the law in and of itself can't be what makes one a member of the new covenant people. It can't be it. So, in this really dense statement of of chapter 4, 13 through verses 13 through 15, it's a pretty dense ideas he's working with here, but they point towards some other themes he's going to be working with throughout the chapter. So one theme he's going to be working with is that the Genesis 15 land promise, right? The promise that Abraham would have land. And he named places, right? We looked at that a couple weeks ago. A big thing to remember here is that it's not just God's intention that Abraham would inherit just this one spot, right? What we see in Paul's argument as we go along is that this is a much bigger idea than just that. In fact, that it'll be that God's people will inherit the entire cosmos, the entire planet, new heaven and earth. So with that in mind, let's take a look back at a couple of these promise sections in Genesis to kind of refresh our memory a little bit. So let's go to Genesis 12:3, which is on page 8, so you don't have to go very far. So Genesis 12:3, we hear this over and over again, this refrain, it's part of the covenant, where God says to Abram at this point, I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So the question we have to ask, Paul keeps bringing up is, how are the families of the earth blessed? He keeps giving us an answer. The answer can't be the law. It can't be only about ethnic Israel, right? How will all the families of the world be blessed? We see this again repeated in 18:18, which is on page 11. This time we get a little bit of the same kind of idea. Seeing that Abraham shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. And you see this again even in chapter 22. So this refrain over and over and over again of all the nations being blessed in Abraham. So when we say nations, who are we talking about? In the Old Testament, whenever you see nations, you always want to think Gentiles. The nations are always those other people outside of Israel. So in Genesis, over and over and over again, we see this refrain that the nations are going to be blessed through the covenant. And remember, when we talk about how that happens, from the very beginning of this covenant being established in Genesis 12, the end of the covenant, the means by which the nations are blessed, is Christ, is Jesus. That's key for our understanding of what's happening here. This is why Paul is going out to the nations and evangelizing them. This is the time in which the nations will come. So with more of that in mind, let's take a look at Isaiah 11, which is on 489. Because what Paul is connecting are the promises in Genesis to the prophecies in Isaiah. So look at, on page 49, Isaiah 11:10. And we see it a lot more clearly here. In that day, the root of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal to the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. So who's Jesse? Question, of course, is Jesse is David's father. So from David's seed will come this person who the nations will inquire. So once again, we have the nations coming in through this root of Jesse.
King James says to it shall be Gentiles.
Right.
See.
Exactly.
So
That word. Right. That word sometimes King James will translate that as Gentiles and nations. ESV almost always goes with nations. I mean, the word is goy, which you've ever heard anyone who speaks Hebrew talk about the goy, the goyim. Those are the nations. Those are Gentiles. So that's the word. So the King James will translate it in a few different ways. But yeah, that's exactly who it's talking about here. In that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Paphos, from Cush, from Elam and Shinar, from Hamath, from the coastlands of the sea. He will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. And then it goes through the different tribal jealousies we put away and so forth. So once again, you have this picture of this root of Jesse, this descendant of David, will be the one who gathers the people back together. So where do we see that happening? We see that happening in the Gospels. We see that happening with Jesus going to the Jew first and then to the Greek. That's how Paul describes the message going out to the world, starting with the Jews and going out to the Gentiles afterwards. Now, more of this we'll handle as we go along. But let's look at one more passage from Isaiah before we move out of Isaiah. See how these work out. Look at Isaiah 42:1, which is on 5:11. Page 511. So, behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. So again, we have in this there's a number of passages. I mean, 49 has this as well. This imagery of this servant, who's originally the idea is that it's Israel who's the servant, right? But over time, as Isaiah goes on and on, it becomes clear it's an individual. And that individual is Christ. Christ, as we say, why does Christ do the things that he does in his life? Why does Christ go to the wilderness? Why does Christ wash himself, why does have John baptize in the Jordan? Why does Christ go through a Passover? Why does Christ do all those things? A big thing we have to remember that Jesus is doing is he's doing what Israel was supposed to do. He's the new Israel in himself. So that imagery of his life to be the just one allows him to be the justifier of us. That's what it makes him. So he fulfills all those promises that are made throughout here. All the way back to Genesis 15, when we talked about the covenant, God walking through the pieces, all those different aspects of it come true and are fulfilled in Christ. And Paul gets this, he sees it, and he's trying to make us see it ourselves. That it isn't Israel following the law somehow that's going to make this happen. It's already been followed by Christ. It's already done in him. And that has massive ramifications. So the argument about, what is it, what do we bring to the table in terms of justification is kind of silly. Whether we're talking about circumcision or whether we're talking about anything else we can invent. How are we the new Israel? How are we the ones who do what Israel was supposed to do? The answer is not. And thankfully, the Gentiles are grafted into the root of justice. And we'll continue on as we go through this and see this. So, what's great about this is this can be taken. The idea is not that ethnic Israel will rule the world. That's not the idea. The idea is that God will rule the world through the Jewish Messiah, Jesus Christ. So this isn't an anti-Jewish thing. This can be taken in a sort of anti-Semitic way, which evil, stupid people do. It's important for us to remember this isn't an anti-Semitic idea. This is an idea. I mean, Paul is a Jew, and he's making this very clear. But the idea is that who's sitting on the throne is a Jewish Messiah. This can't be anti-Jewish. This idea. But the idea is that through him it all comes true, all the promises. That's what we always have to be kind of careful of. Sometimes you'll see these kind of ideas presented in a very unhelpful, insensitive way, and that's not the idea here. It's that all the good things come true through Christ. And that's amazing. That's great. That's what we're all waiting for. Because the subtle argument here is that in Galatians 3 we read a couple weeks ago, Paul makes the argument that when it talks about the seed that will come, that seed is Christ, right? Here the sense is that the offspring he's talking about, it can't be the ethnic Jews who will just be the heirs, right? Because if that was the case, then nobody would inherit anything. It was just them. And it's a subtle argument. This is what he means by that. Why is this the case? Because the Torah, the law, shows the sin of Israel. Israel has the law and fails to keep it. It shows it over and over and over and over again. We see that over and over and over again in the Old Testament. Sin invokes wrath. Right? So, if the inheritance were confined to ethnic Israel alone, all the outsiders would be in trouble because they're not part of ethnic Israel, and ethnic Israel would be in trouble because they haven't kept the law. So it's this. That's the way it is. That we're all doomed. Is Paul's point. That's the tightness of this argument. So thank God it's not that. Thank God that Christ has come and fulfilled the law, and Christ being the Jewish Messiah promised in so many passages. He's the one who comes and does what needs to be done. So, important too to remember, this isn't a slur against the Torah. This isn't a slur against the law. The law does its work. Just because the law brings wrath, it's not the law that brings the wrath, it's the sin that brings the wrath. So it's not the law is bad. That's not the idea here. The law does what it does. It shines a mirror on us, really. It's only showing us who we are. I mean, if the mirror goes away and you have a dirty face, even if the mirror's not there, right? I mean, so you can't get mad at the mirror. You can, I suppose, but it's not. It doesn't make much sense. Unfortunately, sometimes that'll happen when people think about these passages. Well, they'll think, well, the law is just dirty and horrible. I don't need that old bad law stuff anymore in my life. Well, it is if you want to know kind of what what God thinks of how the world should operate, which we would think we would kind of want to think about. And that's why Paul makes a big point of talking about what does it mean to live as a Christian after being justified. That's why he talks about it a great deal. So I mean that's something to consider, to think of it as well. But we can't get mad when that mirror is put in front of us. So there's a very confusing part in this. Let's go back to Romans 4, because there is a part of this that is a wee bit confusing. The end of verse 15, or really verse 15 in total. For the law brings wrath. Got it. We understand the law brings wrath because people don't fulfill it. But where there is no law, there is no transgression. So what does that sound like? It sounds like if you don't have the law, then you're good, right? That's not what he's saying. He's using a very technical term here, this idea of transgression. He's not saying that Gentiles who didn't have the law weren't sinning. That's not what he's saying. Because remember, we read chapter 1, chapter 2, where Paul, especially at the end of chapter 1, where Paul really digs into the Gentiles for being sinners, right? I mean, it just opens us all bare. They're like, oh, yep, I see myself there. He's talking to saints in Rome. He knows that's that old life, that old man that we have to continue to throw away. But that's not the case here. So it's helpful to have that front section to kind of help us understand what's being said here. Sin very much exists outside the Jewish people. What he's saying here, but there's an explicit violation of a known commandment. It's one thing to break a commandment, but it's one thing to know about the commandment and then break it. It's a common thing in our law that ignorance of the law is not. You can't use that as a defense in a trial. There's a fancy Latin term which I can't remember at the moment. But it's a common in our law. You can't just say, "Oh, I didn't know." Like you can't be driving your car over the speed limit, get pulled over, and say, "Oh, officer, I didn't know what the speed limit was." What happens? You still get a ticket, right? That's the same idea here to a certain extent. That's an imperfect analogy, but that's the idea. So what is he talking about? The point is, what he's referring to is that Abraham, not possessing the Torah law, was not in a technical sense a transgressor. In that very limited technical sense, not a transgressor of the law. Still sinful, still an idol-worshiping man in need of being called out of his sin, but not technically, in this sense, a transgressor of the laws that he didn't have it. But built on top of that is that Gentiles can inherit the promises made to Abraham without going through the Torah first, is the idea, because they're not transgressors in this technical sense. That's all he's saying there. So remember, there's no kind of getting around this. No, like, oh, geez, if I'd only had not heard the Bible, I'd be okay. No, that's not this. I mean, there's just so much in the end of chapter 1, and basically where that just kind of blows that whole idea out of the water. But you will still see people hear people say that sometimes. Like, Paul had sort of a split personality, and here he's like, oh, he just whispers, oh, by the way, you don't have to worry about any of this stuff. Like, no, obviously he's not suffering from some split personality. He means the same thing he meant before. So we're going to look at verses 16 through 17 to finish up. That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. So this is the crux, in some ways, of Paul's argument in chapter 4, kind of encapsulated in these two verses. When we look at it, we have to keep the covenant in view. That's being talked about. But also the idea of justification by grace through faith in the promise. Right? The promises that God makes to Abraham come true. God keeps his promises always. So that's something that link through all the messy history, for all the vast instances in which humans fail miserably, it's important to remember that God, through all of that, is going to keep his promise, no matter what. Here, this word he uses, or a phrase he uses, adherent to the law. See, he says, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham. Adherent of the law is kind of a shorthand for Jew here. And one who shares the faith of Abraham is kind of a shorthand for Gentile here to a certain extent. Remember we talked about that, so that unique relationship Gentiles have in that they've called the same way as Abraham? This is kind of a recapitulation of that. So what does Paul say over and over again? That faith comes to the Jew and the Greek. Almost always in that order. Jew first, then Greek, then the Greek. Greek being, as I say, a stand-in for all the nations. Which isn't a bad stand-in, because what language does everybody speak in Greek and all nations? So, yeah, it's a good stand-in for that throughout the Roman Empire. So if you kind of get, because otherwise you could read this and kind of say, well, adherence to the law then are naturally, that's how you get in. Once again, it's helpful to remember he spent an awful lot of time telling us that it's not one's adherence to the law that justifies you. I mean, if it could give a clue, this is why it depends on faith, right? So that's what he's just using there as a little bit of shorthand. So this last part is pretty amazing. Verse 17. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations, in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead, and calls into existence the things that do not exist. That last section is fascinating. That last phrase. Remember, I made you the father of many nations. That's just quoting from all those prophecies in there. We've handled that. We get that. Paul is saying that faith in Christ is how that promise comes true. But what about this God in whom Abraham believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist? One thing to recognize here: these are the peculiar traits of God, of the real God, of Yahweh, of the God worshipped in the Bible. Okay, the God who gives life to the dead. It is a common misconception among people that all sorts of religions were anticipating resurrection, or that there are all these that every religion kind of had their own resurrection myth. This is of itself a myth. Anybody who really does a hard study of these ancient sources of Greek and the various religions throughout the world will find that the idea of a human being dying, being buried, then coming back to life in a bodily form was thought nuts by people in the first century. Nobody was anticipating that whatsoever. We're kind of used to that language now, so it just seems kind of obvious. Well, yeah, but that's the success of the gospel to a certain extent. We're sort of victims of it. Nobody was looking for dead people, particularly no one was looking for one man to come back in Jesus Christ. There was in certain parts of the Jewish religion, you had, so the Pharisees are a good example of this. You had certain groups who thought that at the end of time there would be a general resurrection in which everyone would come back. But the idea that one man would die and come back from the dead was completely out of left field. If you're going to invent a religion in the first century, this would not be the case, because the Greeks didn't believe that your body was a prison. So the Greek philosophers were always would teach that your body is a prison, and when you die, you're set free from that. So why would you want to go back to your body? So this is not the easy way to get into people's hearts with this gospel Paul preaches. It happens all the time. For instance, in Acts, there's a great scene where he's talking to King Agrippa, and Agrippa goes, "Paul, are you nuts? What are you talking about? I think you read too many books. You're losing your mind. Like, I mean, it's just ridiculous what he's saying. But all the witnesses and the momentum of it, all the people who see the risen Christ, it's impossible to put the genie back in the bottle. They've seen it. They can't unsee it. So there's that aspect of it. But there's also the aspect that the God who makes things, calls into existence the things that do not exist. You know, God creates from nothing, right? A lot of ancient gods didn't do that. I mean, you look at creation stories from so many ancient religions. It's not a matter of God, you know, our God speaks creation into being. Most of the time, there are all sorts of battles. Usually, it's battles that happen that create the world. Like in the ancient Near East epics, this is usually the way it happened. The idea that a God sort of just creating everything out of his own goodness and bringing order is pretty rare, actually, in stories. So there's that aspect of this. There's also a fascinating part of this possibility here as well that we see in these two ideas. It could be that Paul is describing sort of the double road of justification. I mean, it's one road, it's of two lanes that he talks about in chapter 3, verse 30. You can look back at just for a second. We'll just peek back there. Chapter 3, verse 30. Since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. That's the same way, but it's just a little different way he kind of describes it. It's possible that when we look at this section here, this last section of 15, or excuse me, of 17, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist, it's possible that he's talking about Gentiles and Jews here. The idea being that when God calls a Gentile into faith, it's a creation out of nothing. There's no history there. The person has no previous covenant membership of any sort. This might explain the interesting word Paul uses, this calls into being, right? Which is a word Paul often uses for the effect of the gospel on people, that idea of being called. And then the other side of it, who gives life to the dead, could be the idea of a Jew coming to share in the faith of Abraham. The idea being this is more like a life out of death, a renewal even of covenant membership. So it could be that that's what he's using to describe here. But in any event, we recognize that justification is literally being brought back from, or being made alive. And that's a beautiful, amazing thing. Always looking forward to the resurrection, the final resurrection, which we all will be brought back. First seen in Christ. I mean, what makes the resurrection a certainty is the resurrection of Christ. It's no longer just a prophecy. It's happened in him. And you know, this explodes Paul's mind for all intents and purposes. And so he goes throughout the world bringing the nations in because this is the time that they are to come in. Because the resurrection has already happened in Christ, the first fruits of our future resurrection that will be to come. And just as our final sort of thing to think about tonight, let's look at Isaiah 65, which actually got the page for that for you. 529 is the page for that. Isaiah 65:17 is particularly I'd like us to look at. So again, we see the Creator God at work. For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come into mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be gladness. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. No more shall there be an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days. For the young man shall die 100 years old, and the sinner 100 years old shall be accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. So this idea of a new heaven, new earth, I encourage you to read the rest of that chapter. This sort of gives us the idea. It's a beautiful vision of this new creation that's coming. And it's important to remember that a God who can defeat death, and a God can certainly recreate us and make us good, and can also recreate and redeem the world. And I think that's ultimately that's as we kind of fight our way through the dense but really beautiful, once they open up to us arguments of Paul, it's important to remember that he is preparing for this every day, and it's only a matter of time. Any questions on that? Any thoughts? I hope we get excited by that idea of resurrection still. I think, unfortunately, sometimes it can kind of be this sort of resurrection, yeah, I guess. But the idea that death has no more hold over us. If we really work that out in our brains, my goodness, I mean, what can possibly have a hold on us if that doesn't? That to me, I mean, what does any petty thing that hurts us, or anyone's vitriol, or even any bad thing that happens in the world, I mean, what does it possibly compare to the fact that we will be here and all things will be made right? That to me is such a great comfort. And it's not just a comfort for me to sit back and be comfortable. It's a comfort for me to go and engage and give of myself, because I know I'm free to do that now. And I know that even if I don't make it all, even if I'm not very good at helping people, I know that Jesus has that already done. I'm just I'm free to be good. I think that's the key idea, a key idea here as well, that we can embrace more fully, which is great news for us. That yoke that we have is off our shoulders. We don't have to save the world. Christ already did, which is nice, because I know I would be bad at it. It's great news. It's great. No, I can't take credit for that. No, I don't even want to take credit for that quote. Yeah, exactly. It's exactly. Yeah, Christ did all the work. I don't know. I'm with you. No. I know what you mean. Indeed. Yeah, no, absolutely. I like that a lot. But yeah, that's great news, and that's the news Paul brings to people when they go, and they're floored. And hopefully that's the news we hear all the time.
But no, I just think that's a good point, especially if you see a lot of just new media posts, everyone's trying to save the world, everyone's trying to do their part, which is good in a sense,
right?
But it's like we're going to be.
There's a desperation in it.
Yes.
There's a if we don't do this, it's over.
Yeah.
And the Christian is just never to be desperate.
Yeah.
What are we to be desperate over?
Right. Yeah, it's just something constantly chasing something, trying to grab a bullet. You never.
Yeah.
It's just not for us to do because it's been done.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I think that's exactly right. No, I think you're right. Anyone who looks on social media or anyone even the news, there's this sort of this desperate urgency of things.
Right, and it's not that it's not that we're supposed to just sit back and be lazy.
Right.
We're supposed to live in our calling, so to speak.
Absolutely.
It's just the way in which it's been done. Like you said, it's just kind of this feeling of desperation, which doesn't have to be, because Christ is peace. And
right.
What is all that? So,
yeah, we're just mopping things up here.
Yeah.
Christ has already won the victory.
Right. But it's that whole thing, man, trying to play God.
Right. We want to be the hero.
Right.
We want to be the hero of the story.
Exactly.
We want God's story to be our story.
Right.
We want to be about us. I want to be the hero here, and so we feel like we got to be that hero, smashing things and get everything done. It's much harder to be humble and say, no, I'm not the hero. Let me tell you who is.
Who is?
That's harder.
The role here.
Right.
Let me help you seek Him more, find out more about Him, kind of guiding to Him versus, like you said, being the hero.
And that emphasis is so key on Christian service. A lot of groups are very serious about their Christian service, but to what end is the question? Why are you doing this? Are you doing this because you think it's in service to your own self-righteousness? That's terrible. But I mean, the flip side is also bad, where you sort of sit back and go, I'm not doing anything.
Christ did it, I'm doing it.
Yeah. I have no role to play in this world. That's equally bad.
And now, Brian, but then that raises the question, well, why are you here?
Yeah.
Everyone has purpose.
Right.
Everyone has role. So.
It's also good news.
Which is exactly.
Indeed. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We can break from there.
Sorry, I didn't get to leave work until 6:50.